introduction. So we are your presenters for today. My name is Michael Thomas. I use he, him pronouns. I identify as white. There's a picture of me with my best friend there. And I am the HUD, it's called the Regional Teams Point of Contact. So I am basically the go-to TA provider for the Alaska Balance of State Continuum of Care and for the Anchorage Continuum of Care. And then I work on at least one other thing with each of the COCs as well, or I'm sorry, with the Balance of State. So anyway, I am happy to be here with you. I will toss it over to my colleague, Alyssa, to let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's good to see all of you and recognize some of you. My name is Alyssa Parrish, pronouns are she, her, and I am Asian. Similar to Michael, I'm a HUD TA provider. I don't do actually anything specifically with the Alaska COCs at this point, but Michael mentioned regional teams and I oversee that initiative on behalf of HUD for HUD technical assistance. So it really is meant to provide a light touch or ongoing point of contact for every COC across the country. So that's how you have Michael with you in your spaces. So really excited to be here with you today, and apologies ahead of time if there's some little background noise. It's a little bit later here in the lower 48, and I have two little girls that we tried to get the yelling out ahead of time, but you know, that doesn't always work. So just some apologies ahead of time if you hear them.
All right, thank you very much. So now we would like to hear from you guys. So we're going to ask you to drop some introductions in the chat so we all know who's here. We're going to be, spending some time in this space together over the next few weeks. So it's helpful to know who's in the room so we can have, open, honest dialogue and all that good stuff. So if you would please drop into the chat your name, the organization or entity that you are affiliated with, the area of Alaska that you live in. You may define that however you prefer. Your pronouns, any other identities that you might like to share. And then just as a brief check-in question, what's the farthest you have ever traveled? I didn't answer that previously. My home base is near Atlanta, Georgia. The farthest I have traveled from there is Tunisia. Went to a couple of places in that country. Interestingly, second farthest is probably Juneau, Alaska. So yeah, if you guys would start dropping that in the chat, would very much appreciate that. And we can probably move on, unless you want to tell us the farthest you've traveled, Alyssa.
I mean, hands down, I'd have to say it was either Japan or Korea from, actually at the time I was living in Colorado. So I think that's going to be the farthest.
All right, so while we're dropping that in the chat, we can go ahead and start getting into the content. When we do trainings of this type, we typically like to acknowledge right up front that some of this is probably going to feel uncomfortable. That is the nature of having these conversations, and we can use that to our advantage. We would ask that you lean into the discomfort and ask why when you are feeling that discomfort, because that's how we really get through a lot of these conversations and get pertinent things out of them when we talk about equity and inclusion. And we do really want this to be a conversation. We want to hear from you. We want to know what you're thinking. We want to know how this plays out where you work. So let's keep that in mind. We would like for it to very much be a dialogue. So in that spirit, we like to set up some group agreements for how we show up in this space. The group agreements we are presenting here are that we would ask you to be present, to listen actively, and to use I statements. So again, when you're feeling that discomfort, it's helpful to think about how that is reflecting within you. Use I statements to express that. Participate to the fullest of your ability. So our collective growth depends on the inclusion of every individual voice. Again, we want to hear from you. So we ask that you participate to the fullest extent that you can. Keep in mind, the goal is not to agree, but rather to gain a deeper understanding. We might not agree on everything, but we can strive to understand. Choose courage and bravery over comfort. So again, I keep repeating it. Some of this might be uncomfortable. We want to be brave and address that. Challenge the way that we have historically responded to homelessness. In many communities, when we talk about equity and inclusion in this space, it conflicts with the traditional response structure. So we want to keep that in mind, and we can challenge that. see each of us and our collective growth as part of the solution. So what we are doing here in this space is meant to drive towards solutions. That's the goal. We also want to keep that in mind. So those are the group agreements. We will present these in all of the meetings up front, but want you to keep that in mind as we're having this conversation with you. So our agenda for today, today's session is really around defining common terms. So we're going to talk through the terms that we'll use so we can all have a shared understanding. And then we'll touch on how to turn that learning into action. So key points here, this is only the beginning. There is a lot of stuff around equity, right? It's a very big topic. And what we're getting into today is really just starting to scratch the surface. But it is important to make sure that we're speaking the same language. We know that homeless response systems serve people who have been historically minoritized at disproportionate rates. And we do want to talk about actionable steps. That's why we're going to try to follow up at the ends of our sessions with how to turn learning into action. But yeah, today's session is really built around making sure that we all understand what we mean when we say certain terms so that we're, again, speaking that same language. So what you see here on your screen is sort of some grounding context. So again, this is only the beginning. We want to start from a place of shared understanding because that's going to be critical for how we get through these conversations. We often move with a sense of urgency because the work we do directly impacts people in this field. And so it's very natural to, when you have a moment of greater understanding or when you identify something that's an area of opportunity in these conversations, to want to move with urgency around that. And we will move to action. That's, again, why we're going to have learning into action steps to think about. But without grounding ourselves in equity, we can potentially cause more harm. So we want to make sure that we're really considering how we move forward. And, some other notes I want to talk through here. So when you hear us say disparity or racism, make sure that we all understand that the same way. Again, that goes back to that common grounding, common understanding. So we are going to, again, spend a lot of time on definitions, but the work you do is important. It does impact people directly. That does not mean that we have to take action right now. We do want to thoroughly think through how we approach the things that we're going to discuss over the next sessions. Again, so we don't unintentionally cause more harm in the process of trying to affect positive change. So I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to start getting into some of the substantial parts of the conversation.
Thanks so much, Michael. We can probably go on to the next slide. And what we have here is actually a screenshot from a video. If we had more time, usually these sessions are 90 minutes, but also recognizing that, an hour is a long time, and asking a lot of you all, and knowing that we have 5 of these scheduled, really wanted to be as effective. So making sure that what we're hitting on is really, really important, and emphasizing that, but also most efficient with your time. So this is a video. It's a screenshot of a video, and I'm going to drop a link into the chat. We are not going to watch it today, but if you can see, it's only about 4 minutes long, and it is a really powerful visual representation about structural racism, and really walks through, these are these folks that are going through this race, and how different barriers at different points in time impact different folks as they are all ideally, going towards the same outcome. So again, really great visual representation. If you are a visual learner, or if that is most effective for you, we encourage you to take some time to watch it. Again, it's only 4 minutes long. So we can go on to the next slide and really start to dig into our shared definitions. So Michael mentioned earlier, shared definitions are important. And I think, many of you probably know I come from the data space. And so I'm going to use that analogy of shared definitions. I think there are often times in a lot of different spaces where we are using the same term and actually meaning very different things. So in the HMIS space, one of the things that I found often in my role was that I would talk about something like I'll use approximate date, this episode of homelessness started as an example, and thinking that I was meaning the same thing that the person that I was trying to, explain that data element to also understood it to be, and actually realizing that those were very different definitions. And we were actually talking about very different things, even though we were using the same words to explain the thing. So this is really a level setting or a pause to understand here are terms that we often hear when we're talking about equity, inclusion, diversity, racism. And here's how we are defining them collectively so that when I say structural racism, for example, that we know that we're speaking the same thing and meaning the same thing. So I'm going to drop a link into the chat as a reference guide. There was actually a previous link on here, but I checked it earlier and it takes me to an unsafe website that won't let me actually click through, and I don't think I want to. So found a different website to reference and leverage. It's the same concepts and same terms that we're referencing. So there are 4 distinct categories of racism. For the most part, when we talk about racism within the homeless response system, we're really focused on that structural piece because that is what significantly impacts people experiencing homelessness. And we also want to recognize that the structural racism is actually built upon and framed within other categories of racism. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about individual racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, and structural racism. And really what we're talking about is scale, scope, and how those impact both the person individually as well as the whole. So that first one, internalized or individual racism, is really this set of the beliefs, the prejudices, the ideas that you as a human or me as a human, I'll use I statements, me as a human hold. They come from my upbringing, they come from my experiences in life, they come from just my knowledge of the world and the way I was raised, the neighborhood I grew up in. It shapes who I am. So those beliefs, those values, those prejudices, whether they are conscious or otherwise, about the superiority of whites and the inferiority of people of color. And then among people of color, internalized or individual racism really manifests as internalized oppression. And among whites, it really manifests as internalized racial superiority. So that is really the individual or internalized racism. Interpersonal racism is when it's an interaction between people or with other people. So when a person's conscious or subconscious racial bias influences their interactions and perceptions of other people. So this is really when there are interactions that are happening between people, and those microaggressions, those outright aggressions are happening in those interactions. Institutionalized racism is the implicit or explicit rules and regulations within a single organization that discriminate against historically and currently marginalized and minoritized communities. So this is really talking about within a single organization, the policies that are in place that impact people of color disproportionately to marginalize them. And then structural is how that happens between and across different organizations. So these are biased laws, policies, practices that really restrict people's access to services, opportunities, and resources because of their race. And again, that would be across organizations, cross-organization at the structural or systemic level. So those are the 4 different categories of racism. And if we go on to the next slide, and you can see in that graphic that they all intersect with each other, which is what I was saying in the beginning. So the other important distinction, there are a lot of important distinctions, but really wanting to define and clarify equality, equity, and liberation. So there are different versions of this graphic out there in the world. I think usually we see the reality, equality, and equity. The liberation and or justice and or freedom has been added to this graphic over the last, I would say, couple of years. So you see the reality right now. The reality is that there are folks that aren't even on the same box. There are some folks that get more, there are some folks that get less, and there are some folks that actually get less than. And so equality is really looking at, we're going to give everybody the same thing. We're going to give everybody access to the same thing. We're going to give everybody access to, in this picture, the same box, regardless of where they are starting from. So we see in this picture, right, that same access to the same box, but because of where they're starting, people at different heights in this example, there are still folks who can't see the game because the amount of support that they received wasn't sufficient. So equity factors in where folks start and gives them access to the supports they need to get to the same outcome. So in this third frame, we see the person who's the tallest that actually never needed support. We don't give them support. The one in the middle that needed a little bit, we gave them a little bit, and the one on the end that needed the most, we gave them the most, so that they all have that same outcome. And then liberation is, we don't have to worry about this at all. Like, it's not a thing, because there's access regardless. There are no barriers in place. So it's really looking at this as a step-by-step process. I think for a long time, we were really focused on the equality piece. And in the housing world, I remember when HPRP was a thing back in 2010. And the guidance that I got as a case manager was, every family that is served through HPRP gets 3 months free rent, hands down, regardless of where they're starting from. And that was, in my brain, that's equality, right? We're not necessarily factoring in where people are starting from, what supports they actually need. It was just, this is the program, this is how we're administering it, this is what people get. That's equality. As we move forward, and as we learned more about the program, it was looking at, okay, each individual household as a unique household, and looking at what supports are they coming in with? What income sources do they have access to? And what level of support do they actually need from this program to be able to sustain housing? Because that's the goal, is for them to sustain housing regardless of where they're starting. And so that means that some households did receive that 3 months of free rent, but others started out paying rent because they had the ability to do so. It was just at a subsidized rate. So that's really looking at it from an equitable standpoint. And liberation would mean that we don't actually need housing subsidies ever. So that's a long ways off, I think. All right, if we can go to the next slide. These are a couple of other terms that we often use. And I think, Michael, you mentioned disparity or disproportionate. I can't remember which term you used in the beginning, but they are different. They are different, so we want to define them. We are going to dig a little bit into your local data and the local data that you have available to you. And we'll talk about the why there. But before we dig into that, we do want to talk about disproportionality, disparity, and data quality. So disproportionality, as you can see here, is really significantly impacted by the intersection between and among the homeless response system and other systems and institutions. So I think Michael said in the beginning, you know, the folks who experience homelessness are impacted by a lot of other systems of care. We have entire sessions and content on that intersectionality between the homeless response system and other systems and institutions like child welfare, like education, like criminal justice. So we know that the folks that we see in our homeless response system are not solely experiencing homelessness because they are accessing our homeless response system. There are other disparities that are occurring within those other systems of care and institutions that are impacting who actually experiences homelessness. And that's really speaking to disproportionality. The other tool that I will reference that looks at disproportionality is the COC race and ethnicity analysis tool, because that pulls in, and we'll talk more about data sets that are available to you in a little while, but that's the clearest example that I can give around disproportionality, because it does include the general population data, the poverty level data, and then I think it's right now the 2022 or 23 pit count data. That's going to show you disproportionality between those different populations. Disparity is really when the homeless response system is performing better or worse related to one racial category or another. So when we look at who's experiencing homelessness in your homeless response system, there's going to be, of everyone experiencing homelessness, a specific percent who identifies as Alaska Native, American Indian, Alaska Native. There's going to be a specific percent that identifies as white, as Asian, as Middle Eastern, North African, so on and so forth, and multiracial. And then within that, we're going to look at, of those who are experiencing homelessness, how many of those are permanently housed? How many folks are able to access shelter? How many folks are assessed through coordinated entry? And that's really looking at the disparities between who is experiencing homelessness in full. And then again, how is the homeless response system serving those different subpopulations and how effectively? And then data quality. We can't talk about analyzing our data without also just having a mention of data quality. I will also just mention that it is this balance between, you don't want to say, we're not going to look at our data at all because it's not accurate or it's not entirely accurate. I can't remember the term of like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good or something like that. You all have done a lot of work to improve and really focus and address your data quality over the years. And so I think, you know, data in HMIS will never be perfect. And we all know that. For what you have, it's going to be really important to be able to understand this is a disparity that I'm seeing and be able to know, okay, this could be a potential data quality issue or is a true disparity. So data quality is always going to be a consideration when we're talking about looking at data for the purposes of system performance, for the purposes of looking at disparities in inequity. And we shouldn't let it prevent us from moving forward and looking at it because we know it's never going to be perfect. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions so far, but please feel free to put in comments and or questions in the chat. We will definitely respond to those. We are going to pivot to really looking at disparities in your local homeless response system. So we got some data from ICA and some other sources to really look at, for Alaska Balance of State, what disparities exist. Because when we talk about racial inequities or we talk about disparities in the homeless response system at the national level, like we understand that we're looking at that at a very big aggregate level. When you start to look at it by geography, by region, by COC, and even within like a balance of state like yours at the regional level within that balance of state, those disparities look very different across the country. So if we go on to the next slide, we're going to start at the general level of, we actually have a lot of data that is available to us in the homeless response system. I'm not going to try and overwhelm with all of the different reports that are available, but just wanting to reference these next couple of slides to identify, you know, often when we work with communities to mobilize data, it's because there's been a question at the local level to understand how many people are experiencing homelessness, or how many people are unsheltered, or how many people are being housed. And those questions seem very simple on the face of things to answer, but when you actually start to dig into it, there are many different reports. My actual technical term is there are a billion different reports that actually answer your question of how many people are experiencing homelessness, but it's a matter of how you want to answer that question. And so we're going to start at the point in time count level, which I know that that reporting is still being submitted to HUD this week, so I'm sorry about that. But the PIT count happens every year, right? We know that it happens in the last 10 days of January. We know that there are a lot of caveats around the point in time count. We know that there are, you know, weather implications. We know that there are a lot of factors outside of the PIT count itself that impact how many people are actually counted during the PIT count. And also, for some communities, it is the most comprehensive count of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness that they are going to have. And it also includes data about people who are served in our non-HMIS participating providers, like victim services providers and other non-HMIS participating providers. So The main thing I'm gonna say is this one report to rule them all is that there isn't one report to rule them all. There are different pros and cons of each report that's available to us in our homeless response system, and that's what we're trying to highlight here. So pit count, good job, is submitted today. That's amazing. That's amazing, actually, because I've heard all kinds of issues with HDX 2.0. So I'm glad you got that done. Congratulations. Housing inventory count, or the HIC, is a supplement to the point in time count. It is your bed and unit inventory that is available on the same night as the point in time count. I will say that this is a pretty comprehensive count of beds that are available to people dedicated specifically to people experiencing homelessness. I will say that it is not a count of affordable housing available in your community, right? That's not its purpose or intent. The longitudinal systems analysis, or the LSA, which is visualized using Stella Performance or Stella P, really does begin to look at performance level data. So far, point in time count, that's really a count. It doesn't start to look at performance. LSA does, and it does look at it at the household level. And there are, I call them the big three performance measures. It really does look at how long are people experiencing homelessness, where are folks exiting to once they leave the homeless response system, and how many households are returning to our system after they exit. Again, this is reported at the household level, so there's going to be some nuance there that you will miss at the individual client level, which is what the system performance measures are, and we'll get to that in a minute. I will say there's been a lot of work done on Stella P to disaggregate that data by race, by ethnicity, by household type. There's some special populations like adult only 55 plus, so kind of elderly. There are the adult and child households with 3 or more children, which apparently is the identification of large families. So there are different ways in which that data is kind of cut to begin to look at disparities that may exist in your system's performance. So if we go to the next slide. Coordinated entry prioritization or by name list is not necessarily a HUD-defined report, right? This is something that has been developed at the local level to support your local coordinated entry system. So often, the coordinated entry prioritization list looks at who is currently prioritized for housing or housing resources in your community, how long people are on the list, who is actually being prioritized, and being able to look at that for disparities. This is also sometimes called an active list, and we have actually done a lot of listening sessions with communities over the last several months to understand how they define active list. And speaking of shared definitions, there is not consensus on what an active list actually is across the country. So, when we talk about active list, prioritization list, by name list, communities are using that in very different ways to help support, their coordinated entry system or help support their homeless response system in full. System performance measures, I mentioned them earlier when we were talking about LSA, but that is really looking at similar performance measures as that LSA looks at, but it looks at it at the individual client level. So the example that I often use where there would be a difference in what these reports tell you is you have a family of 5 and they exit the homeless response system, and later on 3 of the 5 household members return to homelessness. The system performance measures are going to count those 3 members as returns to homelessness because the SPMs do look at that data at the individual client level. For the LSA, that household is actually not going to be counted as a return in those performance measures because that report is looking at it at the household level. So it's not looking if those 3 household members are returning, it's looking if that household as a whole is returning to the homeless response system. So while it's looking at similar performance measures, it's not looking at it in the same way. So I will also say that it's not like you can pull up a report over here, pull up a report over here and say, well, the number over here for the number of people experiencing homelessness or the number of returns to homelessness is not the same as the number over here. They may not be meant to be the same number. It really depends on how those reports are programmed and what they're looking for. That's why there's no one report to rule them all. I mentioned the COC race and ethnicity analysis tool earlier. It is the only HUD tool right now that pulls in census data and poverty data and looks at it in relation to the point in time count. And then there's data about your victim services providers. I know that across the Alaska Balance Estate, there are a lot of them. And in some communities, they are the only service provider providing services to people experiencing homelessness. So that is I would say that's a fairly large part of your homeless response system specifically. And being able to, partner with VSPs, knowing that they can't enter data directly into HMIS is an important puzzle, because often what we see is that the disparities that exist in the victim service providers data is very, very different than the disparities that exist in the general or mainstream homeless response system. And then we have project level reports, your APRs, which I heard somebody call them APRs earlier this week, which I had never heard, but that was really great. CAPRs, which we do here. So APRs for CSC funding, CAPRs for ESG funding, and other project level reports like your PATH annual report, your RIE export, some of those at the project level. Typically don't disaggregate that data significantly by race and ethnicity or other intersectionalities of identity. The APR and CAPR specs were updated in 2024 to add some questions that begin to look at some of the performance by race and ethnicity, but because of the way that those reports are structured, it is still really difficult to do any further analysis on that. But it can be a starting point to understand performance issues at the project level that are then feeding into your broader system level performance. Couple more, and these are not data. Sorry, these are not reports. These are absolutely data. These are not reports. These are more just data or other types of data that can help you understand your homeless response system. So system mapping looks at how your system is currently set up. So how do folks access and flow through your homeless response system? That's like what is happening today. System modeling looks at what can happen tomorrow if I change X, Y, or Z. So this is our reality. This is our ideal. Mapping is our reality. Modeling is our ideal. There's also data that is kind of in our adjacent systems that it could be really relevant to include in our understanding of people experiencing homelessness. So I know I've heard intersections between homeless data and Medicaid, for example, or HMIS data and general electronic health records, or during the pandemic, it really was looking at homeless data and immunization information systems. So looking at who is able to access vaccinations. So just looking at those systems, which are again, adjacent to our homeless response system, but by including that data or seeing the connections between those data can be really helpful in understanding the person as a whole, because we know that when we are working with people experiencing homelessness, they are whole humans who access other systems of care. And in order to serve them effectively and efficiently, being able to understand what supports and services they need without re-traumatizing them, connections to other data sets are really helpful. And then qualitative data. So we just talked through a lot of quantitative or numbers-based data. Qualitative data is also really important to incorporate in understanding the disparities that exist in your system. So the numbers, the quantitative is going to tell you what disparities exist all day long. They will never tell you why those disparities exist. And that's why this qualitative or contextual information is so important. That's where you start to understand, are these actually data quality issues rather than disparity issues, or are these true disparities? And if they are true disparities, what is the context behind this? So we did some review of data that was provided to us. And I am going to kick us off with what we learned. And then I think I'm going to hand it over to Michael to go over some more. So the who is experiencing homelessness, which isn't necessarily speaking to performance of the homeless response system. It's just looking at who is experiencing homelessness in the Alaska Balance Estate. For the 2022 point in time count, people who identify as American Indian, Alaska Native, or Indigenous were overrepresented, and overrepresented based on both your general population data as well as the poverty population data. So this is coming from the COC Race and Ethnicity Analysis Tool. Specifically, And additionally, families with children experiencing homelessness during that point in time count included a disproportionate percent of Hispanic, Latinx, or Latin households. So that was only showing in that specific subpopulation of people experiencing homelessness that were counted during the point in time count, but it was pretty disproportionate. And that answers my question about the most recent data that's in the COC race and ethnicity analysis tool. It is the 2022 point in time count. We also looked at, you have a data point in HMIS that specifically asks about Native Regional Corporation affiliation. So looking at that data, there were 4 corporations that were identified the most for the Alaska Balance Estate. So of the people who identified with a primary Native Regional Corporation, the top 4 identified were Callista, and they were predominantly served in Bethel. Alaska, predominantly served in Juneau. Bering Straits, predominantly served in Nome, and Doi Unlimited, predominantly served in Fairbanks. And I'm curious for you all if those make sense to you, or if like anecdotally or contextually or qualitatively, that makes sense. So I'm going to pause and see if there are like yeses, nos, maybes in the chat, or if anyone wants to come off mute and confirm or deny that, or if that was surprising.
That is pretty accurate. However, I want to caution away from using regional, like tribal regional corporation affiliation as an identifier, because most often the funding that shareholders receive is minuscule.
That's a really helpful flag for sure. And thanks, Colleen and Dave, for the comments in the chat. Yes, thanks, Tammy. That is helpful. All of that is helpful. Yes, Dave, do you have a thought you want to share?
Well, when we're talking about Native corporations, each Native corporation is a region. And so one of the things that this doesn't say is what is the percentage of Natives served in that area? And 2, what are the regions served within, let's say, Anchorage? Because I know we've had a handful of people from the Chilista region served here in Juneau. I taught out there for 6 years in the 80s. And so, when you look at the overall service of Natives, it isn't just an homogenous group in one region. They are served throughout the state. In my shelter now, I know we have some Yupik, and I know we have our Chilista and Alaska, and we might have some Athabascan. I wouldn't know for sure, because even when you say Native, it's a big stretch of Native population within our state. 17 different languages.
Thank you for that context. Very helpful. So the other kind of review or analysis that we looked at around Native Regional Corporation is by project type. So of those who identified with the Native Regional Corporation, and or Kim, if you have another way to say that, I would appreciate that, since you mentioned not using it as an identifier.
So being part of a regional corporation or a Native tribal affiliation, that's fine. It's more using it as an identifier, as a determiner for why someone would be in a shelter setting. Because just like was mentioned, these are they're regions. If you look at a map of Alaska that are broken up by the state tribes, these are regions. Just like you said, with Chilista being predominantly in Bethel, well, that's Chilista's region. But in Anchorage, when I worked at Sullivan Arena, we saw everybody. So it's more of a question around, what services are even available in these remote areas across the state. And based on like numbers alone, Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau are going to be your best source of this like legitimate breakdown data, because they have the most congregate amount of people seeking services, and they have the most services available in those areas. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And we didn't pull Anchorage data for this since this was a balanced estate, but I mean, it would be great to get to understand that a little bit deeper and to understand, for me, you know, when I look at this third box, I guess, the Native Regional Corporation and project type, I have some questions that immediately come into mind, and you may be able to explain those, right? You may be able to explain those just by knowing your system and your regions and your areas in your homeless response system much better than us. I think for me, my question would be that access piece, the accessibility piece. So you mentioned like these Native Regional Corporations are in regions. So, you know, that Calista is served in Bethel, predominantly served in Bethel, makes sense because that's their region. And then I wonder how that intersects with that, you know, Native Regional Corporation and project type, 26% services only, can have access services only. Like, are there services only available in Bethel? Like, I don't know. So being
And
able to kind
the
of,
services, yeah, the services that are available in Bethel, they're growing, but really there's only there's a Tundra Women's Coalition who operates it's a DV shelter, and then there's a youth program, and they just launched the first in the region permanent supportive housing program. So services only is literally just like case management to support some of the youth who need to travel from their rural village to Bethel for school, and then need to travel back to their rural village when school is out. This is one of the issues when it comes to pulling this kind of data for a state like Alaska, because these disparities, they're obviously going to say like, yes, disproportionately marginalized communities are being impacted the most. And we are a rural state operating on shoestrings and trying to like patchwork quilt services together to provide as much wraparound as we can, but we're not able to provide the level of service required to meet the need. Does that makes anyway, to circle back to your main question, saying like regional corporation, native tribal corporation is fine. And there's the regional corporation that is predominantly in one region, but there's also their tribal affiliation. And those might not even be federally recognized. I just wanted to shout that out from Tammy in the chat. So I'll hop off this is something I'm really passionate about. I love data. So this is the kind of stuff that gets me excited.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate all of this additional context and nuance. And I think that the pieces that are helpful as we're thinking through disparities and inequities that may exist in the homeless response system is just ensuring, like, is access equitable? I'm hearing that maybe it's not. And even within inequitable access, are there, or can we look at if there are any existing disparities by race within that access? So there's like these intersectionalities upon intersectionalities and be able to tease those apart. Native Corporation shareholder, thank you. And we knew the tribal affiliation, I think there's like hundreds, right, across the state. And I don't think that data is in HMIS. But it would be interesting to see that.
There are over 200 federally recognized tribes in Alaska.
Yeah. Okay, this is super helpful.
Excuse me. My understanding is that almost every village is considered a tribal entity. And so you might have the Calista region, which is, I think, 45 to 54 villages. It's one region with somewhat of a central culture, but it has that many different tribes within the region.
Got it. Very helpful. We are getting a little bit low on time, so I'm just going to wrap up my section around sexual orientation because that was another focus area, and we mentioned in our kind of at marketing materials, comm strategy around this that we would make sure to talk through and incorporate tribal nations and LGBTQIA within the content of all of these. So we did post some data for sexual orientation that's available. It sounds like that is an Alaska Universal Data element. There wasn't a ton of data there. About folks who identify as other than heterosexual, but there was some. And so that data is here. If we go on to the next slide, I think kicking it over to Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Guys, I'll move pretty quickly through these points. It's just some additional analysis we did. I looked at a different source. My colleague, who was the point of contact for the Alaska COCs before me, had done an analysis for the balance of state about a year and a half ago or so. So I looked through the analysis that he did, and then I looked at a couple of different time ranges on the dashboard that is available on the ICA website for the balance of state to see if the trends he identified held steady, and they really did. So that's kind of a key point I want to make here. These do seem to be pretty steady trends. So what I'm about to point out, it's holding true over time. This is for the COC as a whole. So, I do want to note that too. It can be filtered by region on that dashboard. So in the event we needed to dig into any particular regions, we certainly could. And, to Alyssa's point about this being for the balance of state and not having Anchorage data in there, if any of my friends in Anchorage are interested in doing this type of analysis, I am your point of contact. Feel free to reach out. Anyway, so the things I want to point out, first, I noticed some things here on gender equity. So, we focus a lot on racial equity when we define terms and things like that for these conversations, but I also want to be very aware of the different types of equity that we have to think about. Gender equity, age equity, geographic equity, things of that nature. So they're all different types of equity. What we noted for gender here is that women reported history of domestic violence at a higher rate than men. There can be a number of reasons behind that. There can be a number of reasons that it shows up that way in the data. That was also true in the balance of state that I used to work for. And we dug in and found out there were some quite interesting reasons there. So anyway, women reported history of domestic violence at a higher rate than men. And then also people identifying as transgender, non-binary, questioning, having no single gender, or a culturally specific gender identity were far more likely to report history of domestic violence and disabling conditions as well. So looking specifically at that population, they were across the board far, far more likely to report both domestic violence and having a disabling condition, not necessarily at the same time, but they were more likely to report both of those things. The other thing I looked at in there was age equity. So here are some of the key points when I looked at age. In the homelessness response system for the balance of state, men were most likely to be 25 to 44. That's a pretty wide range. And then a slightly lower percentage at 45 to 64. So men in general were pretty much, for the most part, identifying between 25 and 64. And then women in the system were most likely to be aged 35 to 44, but with a slightly lower percentage at 25 to 34. So when we look at those two things together, what we really see is there's a more even distribution across men, but skewing a little to the older side. Whereas with women, there is more of a skew to being younger in the homelessness response system. So that's what we see in comparison there. And then also, people who did not identify specifically and exclusively as a man or a woman were far more likely to be under age 25. So again, people that did not see themselves as the typical definition when we ask, are you a man or a woman? They were far more likely to be younger in the homelessness response system. So I am going to touch on implicit bias, which will be a very important thing to understand as we go through these topics together in these sessions. So we're talking about the biases that we don't realize we have as biases, right? We have a bias when we have a preference for or an aversion to a person or group of people. That's a pretty straightforward definition of a bias. Implicit bias is when these biases occur without our conscious knowledge. So most of our actions occur without conscious thoughts, and our implicit biases often predict how we'll behave more accurately than our conscious values do. So that's a very interesting point. Implicit bias is a universal phenomenon. It is not limited by race. It is not limited by gender. It is not limited by country of origin. So we do not mean to make any assumptions about anyone by saying that you might have an implicit bias. We are saying we all do. It is a universal phenomenon. And in these conversations, it's just helpful to be aware of that phenomenon so that we can think about that as we are reacting to the different things that we are going to go through. So how does this play out? There are a number of reasons that we develop implicit bias, being bombarded with negative imagery, our upbringing, how we were raised can play into that, segregated resources, our perception of how resources are segregated, with whom do we surround ourselves? That is something we do consciously that can then influence us implicitly. And what messaging do we receive? So, how do we get our news? How do we which people, again, going back to whom do we surround ourselves with? What do they bring to us in terms of messaging? All of that plays into formulating these implicit biases that occur in us. So again, just helpful things to keep in mind as we are talking through this over the next sessions. So what you can do about this is become aware. So ask yourself what, when, and where your unconscious bias has shown up. You can think about, a situation you've been in and think critically about it. What, when, and where? How did that unconscious bias show up? Find your triggers. What situations come up where you are most likely to rely on snap decisions and judgments? There are certainly situations where you're more likely to do that than not. So thinking about those triggers and how that plays out for you is really important. Slow down. That's a very important one. When you're having a reaction, take 3 deep breaths and then respond. So just slow down. Think through why you're reacting the way you are. And then do one small thing differently. Once you've identified, these triggers that you have, situations that might cause them, that sort of thing, just do one small thing differently. And that's a very important step towards addressing implicit bias once you've identified. We are also going to have a link here to an implicit bias assessment that you can take. I'm not able to copy that now, but we can either, if one of my colleagues could drop it in the chat, and I believe there it is. So yeah, that is an assessment you can take that will help you identify implicit bias. So learning into action. As promised at the beginning, here are some things we can do to take the things we've talked about today and start turning them into action. So what can you do? Identify one concept that you want to learn more about. Of all the things we talked through today, what's one that catches your attention that you want to learn more about and be more aware of as we go through this journey together over the next few weeks? Take the implicit bias assessment that we just linked. That'll help you understand your own biases. And then learn more about the disparities that exist within your region's homelessness response system. And then you can think about how all of that stuff interacts. That's the end of the content. I have a question slide. Before I do that, since we're a little short on time, I just want to point out this slide. We are going to have links to resources that will go out with this slide deck. So there's the implicit bias test. There's the HUD Exchange Racial Equity Resources site. And then the two at the top there, particularly proud of. ICF developed these for the state of California for a project we have with them. So the Toolkit of Best Practices for Advancing Racial Equity is an amazing resource. Would certainly recommend checking that out. The Tribal Nations Engagement Handbook is also fantastic. That's the one I wanted to get to this slide for because I do want to provide a very important caveat. It was developed for the state of California. And clearly, the landscape there with tribal nations looks far different than the landscape with indigenous populations in Alaska. even down to the language that's used, right? And I don't mean language spoken, I mean the language used in how you would refer to a village versus it's a tribal nation in California. So there are important differences. That's what I want to point out. If you look at that resource, it's really the engagement practices in there that I think are transferable. So just want to say that up front. Please keep that in mind if you look at that resource. We understand it is a different population, and in reality, many different populations within California that it was created for, but the engagement practices we do think are transferable. So that is the end of our content. With just under a minute left, I will ask, what questions do you have? Or comments, or thoughts, or anything that you think will help us progress through our other sessions over the coming weeks.
And can I just add thank you for the conversation around Native Regional Corporation, and just that, you know, it is really helpful to understand. So if there are additional pieces, because we're doing these weekly with you all for the next month or so. So if there are specific pieces that you would like us to dig into, that you would like to educate us about, like in these spaces, we would really like to know that going forward.
Sherry in the chat says, thank you. It's been helpful and informative, and she's looking forward to taking the assessment. Thanks for sharing, Sherry.
I also wanted to offer myself as a resource when talking about the queer community. That is what our organization serves, or who our organization serves, and what we do.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any last comments? Going once? Going twice? If anyone wishes to email questions or comments to me directly, this is Helen, please feel free to do so. We can, if you don't feel comfortable putting things in the chat, more than happy to answer any questions you might have individually. We have 3 more upcoming informational sessions, and then a processing and wrap up and feedback session to close it out with a total of 5. Each of them will build on the other. We are looking forward to seeing you again next week, same bat time, same bat link. And thank you so much to Alyssa and Michael for all of the content and for agreeing to host these trainings for us. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Have a great
Take care,
afternoon.
everyone. See you next week.
Bye.